In 1959, one of the most important scientific minds in history sat down for an interview. But then, that interview vanished. For decades, no transcript circulated, no broadcast aired. The people who knew about it didn't talk about it, at least not publicly. The interview was with Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century. The subject was the afterlife. What Feynman said in that interview was so direct, so uncompromising, that the people controlling its distribution made a decision most of the public never knew about. They buried it. But why would a single interview with a physicist be considered dangerous enough to suppress? If you want to understand why this interview was buried, you first need to understand the man behind it. Richard Feynman was not a typical scientist. Most physicists of his era stayed in their lane, published papers, attended conferences, avoided controversy. Feynman did the opposite. He played bongo drums in nightclubs. He cracked safes at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Just to prove he could, he gave lectures that made quantum mechanics feel like something a curious teenager could grasp. But beneath the showmanship was one of the sharpest analytical minds of the 20th century. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965 for his work on quantum electrodynamics, a framework that describes how light and matter interact at the subatomic level. Most people have never heard of QED, but without it, there are no semiconductors, no modern computers, no smartphones. Feynman's work quietly runs the world. But what made him genuinely dangerous, to institutions, to comfort, to easy answers, wasn't his physics. It was his honesty. Feynman had an almost pathological intolerance for pretense. He once said that the first principle of science is that you must not fool yourself, and that you are the easiest person to fool. That principle didn't stop at the laboratory door. It extended to death, to meaning, to what, if anything, comes after. Most public figures, when asked about death, give a careful answer. Something vague, something comforting, something that offends no one. Feynman refused to do that. Long before the banned interview, his position on death and the afterlife was already clear to those who paid attention. He believed that when you die, you are gone, not transformed, not transcended, gone. He talked about this openly with colleagues and students, but rarely on camera, and almost never in a format that would reach a mainstream audience, because he knew what happened when scientists spoke too plainly about mortality. Careers got complicated, funding dried up, invitations stopped coming, but Feynman was also uniquely positioned to say what others wouldn't. By the late 1950s, he was already famous enough that institutions needed him more than he needed them. That gave him a kind of freedom. And in 1959, someone decided to use that freedom on camera. What's important to understand is that Feynman didn't approach the afterlife as a spiritual question. He approached it as an empirical one. Where is the evidence? What does the data say? What are we actually claiming when we say something survives death? Those questions, asked plainly and publicly, were more threatening than anyone expected. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because what Feynman said in the interview wasn't fringe, it wasn't radical by scientific standards, but it was radical by the standards of 1959 American public life. He argued, clearly and without hesitation, that there is no credible scientific evidence for the survival of consciousness after death. Not a possibility he was open to exploring, not a mystery he found humbling, an unsupported claim, full stop. He went further. He said that the human need to believe in an afterlife is understandable, but that understanding a need doesn't make the thing real. People need comfort. That's real. But comfort is not evidence. Then he said something that likely sealed the interview's fate. He argued that religion, in many cases, actively discourages the kind of honest inquiry that might lead people to face death more clearly. That wasn't just a scientific statement, that was a cultural indictment. In a country where over 95% of the population identified as Christian, where "In God We Trust" had just been added to paper currency in 1957, where anti-communism and religious identity were deeply fused, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist saying that on camera was not going to air without consequences. But the consequences didn't come for Feynman. They came for the interview itself. The official explanation, when one was given at all, was that the interview was not suitable for broadcast. That phrase did a lot of work, because what it really meant was the people with power over the airwaves had done the math. Television in the 1950s was almost entirely dependent on advertiser relationships. Advertisers were terrified of controversy, specifically religious controversy. A single complaint campaign from an organized religious group could cost a network its sponsorship deals. And organized religious groups in 1950s, America were extraordinarily well coordinated when it came to monitoring media. But there was a second pressure that rarely gets mentioned: government. This was the height of the Cold War. American identity was being actively constructed around the idea that the United States was a God-fearing nation, in direct contrast to godless Soviet communism. A prominent scientist publicly dismantling belief in the soul wasn't just religiously inconvenient. It was politically inconvenient. It handed Soviet propaganda a gift. Look, even America's greatest scientists don't believe in the foundations of Western civilization. So the interview was quietly shelved. No dramatic confrontation, no official ban, just a decision made in a room somewhere that the tape would not be broadcast. And for decades, it wasn't. No single villain buried this interview. That's what makes it more disturbing, not less. It wasn't one executive, one senator, one bishop who made the call. It was a system, a network of institutional incentives that made suppression the path of least resistance. Network executives who didn't want to lose sponsors, sponsors who didn't want to lose customers, religious organizations who monitored broadcasts for content that challenged their authority, government communications advisors who understood that public religious sentiment was a Cold War asset. None of these groups needed to coordinate directly. They didn't have to. The system was already built to filter out exactly this kind of content. What's particularly striking is that Feynman himself was never silenced personally. He continued to lecture, publish, and speak freely for the rest of his life. It was specifically the recorded, distributable, mass audience version of his views that was suppressed, because one scientist saying something uncomfortable in a lecture hall is manageable. One scientist saying it to millions of living room televisions is a different problem entirely. Decades passed, the culture shifted, the stranglehold of Cold War religious politics loosened, television became more fragmented, the internet arrived. But the interview didn't resurface through any of that. It resurfaced the way many suppressed things do, through an archive. Researchers working on a retrospective of Feynman's life and work in the late 1990s began tracking down every recorded interview, lecture, and appearance they could find. Most of what they found was expected. But in a storage collection connected to a production company that no longer existed, they found the tape. Unlabeled, unindexed, it had survived not because anyone protected it, but because no one had thrown it away. The contents were immediately recognized as significant. But even then, the path to public release wasn't straightforward. Rights questions had to be resolved. Feynman's estate was consulted. Decisions were made about context and framing. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the interview began circulating, first among researchers, then in documentary form, then online. By then, the world it had been suppressed to protect no longer existed. When the interview finally reached a wider audience, something interesting happened. It didn't cause the crisis that 1950s executives had feared. The world had changed enough that a physicist rejecting the afterlife wasn't front-page scandal. But it did ignite a serious conversation, particularly within scientific and philosophical communities. Because the interview wasn't just Feynman saying he didn't believe in life after death. It was Feynman explaining, methodically, why the question itself is so rarely examined honestly. Most people, he argued, never actually interrogate the EI belief. It's inherited. It's comforting. It's socially reinforced. But the moment you apply the same standards to it that you'd apply to any other empirical claim, the evidence collapses. That argument hit differently in the internet age. Suddenly, it wasn't just circulating in lecture halls and academic papers. It was being shared, clipped, subtitled, discussed on forums, debated on podcasts. A new generation of people who had grown up questioning inherited beliefs found in Feynman exactly what they were looking for. A brilliant, credentialed, deeply human voice saying plainly, "It's okay not to know. It's okay to say there's no evidence." But the scientific conversation had also moved on since 1959, and that created its own complications. Here's what makes this story more than just a historical footnote. The science of consciousness has advanced dramatically since Feynman sat down for that interview, and in some ways, it has made his position harder to hold simply, not easier. Researchers studying near-death experiences have documented cases that are difficult to explain through standard neurological models. The hard problem of consciousness, why physical brain processes produce subjective experience at all, remains genuinely unsolved. Scientists like Christoph Koch, Roger Penrose, and Anil Seth have proposed frameworks that push the boundaries of what we thought we understood about mind and matter. None of this proves an afterlife. But it does suggest that Feynman's confident dismissal, while intellectually honest given what was known in 1959, may have closed a door that science hasn't fully earned the right to close yet. The honest position today isn't certainty in either direction. It's something closer to what Feynman himself claimed to value above everything else: uncertainty, held clearly, without flinching. What's striking is that even the scientists pushing the boundaries of consciousness research are careful to say, "We don't know what this means yet." That intellectual humility, Feynman's core value, turns out to be exactly what the question still demands. So what does this story actually tell us? Not just about Feynman, not just about a suppressed tape, about something more fundamental. Every era has a set of questions it decides are too dangerous to ask in public. In 1950s America, one of those questions was, what if there is nothing after death? Not because the question was new, philosophers had asked it for centuries, but because a Nobel Prize-winning scientist asking it on television, calmly, clearly, without drama, made it impossible to dismiss as fringe or foreign or faithless. It made it real in a way that institutions weren't prepared to handle. So they made it disappear. But here's what they didn't account for. Ideas don't disappear with the tape. Feynman kept talking, his students kept listening, his lectures kept circulating, the interview was suppressed, the thinking wasn't. And when the interview finally resurfaced, it didn't destroy anything, it didn't collapse public faith or trigger a cultural crisis. It just added one more honest voice to a conversation that has been happening for as long as humans have been aware that they're going to die. Feynman's great contribution wasn't his answer, it was his insistence on asking the question without softening it. In a world that still struggles to do that, on all sides of this debate, that might be his most important legacy of all. If you found this video valuable, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.